So, hope everybody had a good weekend. We've got just a couple more days of U.S. history stuff to go over. Again, so if you need to catch up on any of that stuff, you can always visit the YouTube channel and check out the old classes. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about World War II kind of briefly, and then we're going to mostly do some practice questions that kind of go over World War II, and we're going to kind of do that topic just more through practice questions than anything, just because it can be overwhelming, and I don't really need to spend more than just today talking about it. So for those of you that were in class last week, we talked about mostly exactly what this page talks about here, which was the United States and kind of how they emerged as a world power that they still are today, in terms of how they interact politically with the rest of the world. And so by the end of the week, we had kind of talking about World War I and the impacts of that, and the Great Depression, and that kind of brings us to World War II, right? So again, I'm going to actually not pull up the PowerPoint today and just talk about a couple things, and then spend the rest of the time doing some practice questions. So the Great Depression was not just an America thing, not just the United States thing. It was a global issue, right? And so after World War I ends, the world basically falls into this serious economic downturn, right? Where, lots of people are out of jobs, economies are failing, countries are having to deal with this massive crisis, not too dissimilar to kind of the stuff that's going on now. Obviously, different circumstances leading to it, but a similar kind of situation, right? So what you see happening is a combination of the economic turmoil and kind of the destruction in Europe left over from World War I, kind of gives rise to this surge in nationalism and fascist styles of government, where you have dictators who are these charismatic figures who basically are set on, positioning their country as the most powerful country in the world, and you can have this jostling of power. And as well, you have this leftover alliance from World War I, where you have certain countries aligning with other countries, and that's just kind of making things right for conflict. So, of course, the biggest and most famous, not biggest, but the most key player in World War II is Germany, right? So World War I ends, and Germany is basically accused of being the aggressor in World War I. So if you were here in class last week, you know that Germany had to pay war reparations, meaning they had to pay money to other countries basically for the damage caused by the war. Their army and their military forces were taken away. Their country was split, so the physical size of Germany was lessened. So there were all these restrictions put on Germany, and what you see happen is the rise of Adolf Hitler, right? So he comes in and says all these countries are trying to squash us down and keep us doing this, and Germany is the best country. And so he instills this sense of national pride in kind of his country, and uses it to his advantage to do all the things he ended up doing, right? So it kind of begins with Germany attacking smaller nations in Europe. So in the 1930s, Hitler starts attacking these smaller countries. People start to notice, and it doesn't launch World War II right away, but you also have a rise in fascism in Italy. So you have Mussolini in Italy, and they're fighting and taking over Ethiopia and Africa. Japan kind of joins in, and they start attacking China. And so Hitler actually builds this alliance between those three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they essentially form this new alliance. And then the Allied powers, who are still kind of in connection with each other from World War I, because it's only been 20 years, they kind of rejoined to help defeat the Axis powers. And 1939 is kind of really where full-scale war breaks out between the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan versus the Allied powers, who included the United Kingdom, England, France, eventually America, but not America yet. And a lot of the other countries in Europe essentially joined the Allied power. The United States didn't join until 1941. They wanted to try to stay out, right? They were done with international affairs. They wanted to focus on themselves. They were coming out of the Great Depression, and they didn't want to become involved in another world war. And it wasn't until Japan bombed the United States at Pearl Harbor that America actually got involved in World War II, right? So similar to World War I, they stay out until the end, and then the United States kind of comes in to help the Allied powers near the end of the war. So unlike World War II, unlike World War I, World War II, the United States sees fighting in all areas of the world. So World War I was just fought in Europe. World War II sees troops fighting in Africa, Europe, and Asia. So there's kind of troops spread out all over the world. And so logistically, that creates more issues. But because, again, the United States has bases situated now all over the world, it becomes kind of an easier task for the United States to become involved, because there are stations all over the world for the United States to easily deploy and quickly deploy troops to help the Allied powers. So obviously there's a lot that you can go over in terms of World War II. We could talk about specific battles, kind of the destruction caused in Europe. We can talk about the Holocaust, which was basically the genocide of Jewish people in Europe. And we could talk about the dropping of the atomic bomb. So the United States, the only country to have used atomic weapons, they dropped 2 of them on Japan in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right? And led to cataclysmic devastation, right? But not soon after that, the war came to an end. The Allies just couldn't take it anymore and were beaten into submission again by the Allies. So the war ends in 1945, and just like World War I, actually reverse that back. Unlike World War I, where World War I ends, the United States says, "Helped you win. We're going and we're going to go do our thing." After World War II ends, the United States is a major part of helping rebuild the nations in Europe in terms of construction, rebuilding towns and cities that have been destroyed. The United States helps much more proactively after World War II than World War I. And kind of the last little thing I'll talk about is, economically, what World War II does for the United States is essentially take the country out of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression sees this sharp economic downturn, and it actually is helped by the New Deal and FDR creating all of these new jobs and all of these things that were going on that we talked about at the end of the week last week on Thursday. And that helped significantly. But then what really turned the economy around kind of for good was World War II started, and that kind of mobilized the economy to start making things again. And you see a long period of economic progress starting with the New Deal, going through World War II, and kind of into the 50s. So with that said, I'm going to spend the rest of the time kind of going through some practice questions. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the Cold War era and the Civil Rights era, so kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe some 80s. And then that's essentially where we'll stop talking about U.S. history, because anything beyond that isn't going to be critical to the GED test, or kind of the material that you really need to be familiar with. So tomorrow will be the last day of new material, and then Wednesday and Thursday we'll spend it reviewing U.S. history, and next week we'll move on to likely economics. Spend like a week on that. So we're just kind of flying through all these different topics. So in terms of questions for today, so here's some questions that deal with kind of this big chunk of time that we talked about, from imperialism and kind of the turn of the century all the way through the Great Depression, post-Great Depression, World War I, and World War II. Right? So all these questions don't deal with all of those things, but it's kind of the time frame that we're looking at. So number one, we're going to skip, because we actually did this question last week, but we didn't do 2, 3, and 4. So we'll start with these 3, and then I'll pull up some more questions for us also. So number 2 requires a little bit of bouncing back and forth. So kind of bear with me on that. But number 2 says, what assumption do you need to make to fully understand the last sentence in paragraph 4 on page 436? So let's read the paragraph first, and then I'll come back and look at these options, right? So it says the last sentence in paragraph 4. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4, this paragraph here, and we're focusing on the last sentence, right? So just the last sentence. It says, by 1939, war again broke out between the Axis and the Allies, okay? So let's read the question. Again, it says, what assumption do we need to make to fully understand that sentence? Remember, the sentence says, by 1939, war again broke out between the Axis and Allies. A, in World War I, the Allies fought the Central Powers. 2, in World War II, the Allies included England, France, and Russia. In World War II, the Allies included the Germans, Austrian, and Ottoman Turks. Or D, in World War II, the Axis included Germany, Italy, and Japan. Okay, so which of those are they assuming that we already know, right, in order to understand? In other words, it's not explained specifically to us, okay? So let's take a look, okay? Here's the paragraph again. Read it one more time. I'll zoom in a little bit. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to questions here. Very briefly. Thank you for bearing with me. So, if this was me working on this question, the very first thing I would throw out is C. Okay. In World War II, the Allies included the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottoman Turks. I know that's incorrect just because from reading the paragraph, I know Germany is not one of the Allied countries, it's one of the Axis, right? It says it very clearly in the sentence before. So if I zoom back out, and again, sorry for all my zooming, right? But it says, Hitler built an alliance with Italy and Japan, which came to be called the Axis. Germany, Italy, and Japan are the Axis power. We know that because it specifically tells us in the sentence right before. So C is just plain wrong. It's just a false statement. C I would throw out right away, and the other one I'd throw out is D. In World War II, the Axis included Germany, Italy, and Japan. The reason I'd throw that out is because that's not an assumption. That's just stated directly. So they're not assuming we know that, they tell us that, and so there's nothing left for us to assume. So it's either going to be A or it's going to be B. Okay? A says in World War I, the Allies fought the Central Powers, or B, in World War II, the Allies included England, France, and Russia. Okay? So if I were to go back and read the paragraph, the sentence that we're focusing on isn't even talking about World War I. Okay? So by process of elimination, we've just figured out B makes the most sense because the other three just don't seem to add up. Right? And that's exactly the case. B is the right answer, and the reason that B is correct is because they don't actually tell us that they don't tell us who makes up the Allied powers. They just say the Allies defeat the Axis powers, but they don't explain who the Allies are. So they're assuming that you know who they are. So that's why B is correct. All right, let's go ahead and look at number 3. All right. Hopefully we lost some troops. Hopefully they come back. I'm apologizing, or I apologize if I'm boring us to death, but just kind of power through this and then call it good. So this question deals with the U.S. unemployment rate. So more related to the Great Depression, but also kind of ties in the Great Depression and World War II. So the question says, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president during the height of the Great Depression in 1933. He soon instituted a set of federal programs called the New Deal to lower unemployment. And so we talked about that last week. Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president to get us out of the Great Depression. He comes up with this big set of new programs, in other words, things designed to create new jobs, right? Government jobs, try to lower the unemployment rate. So the question asks, which conclusion about the effectiveness of New Deal programs does the text on page 436 and the graph below support? Okay. So we know, based on reading this, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in 1933. Here's 1932, so 33 is somewhere in here, right? This graph shows us the U.S. unemployment rate from 1929 to 1944, right? So up on the left-hand side here is the actual percentage of people that were out of work, right? So 1929, under 5%, goes up to 25%, down again to under 15, and then up again to 20, and then way, way down by 1940. Okay? So again, we're looking to see which of these conclusions is the most accurate, right? So A says, within a year, the New Deal had raised unemployment had raised unemployment pre-depression level. B, within a year, the New Deal had lowered unemployment to its pre-depression level. C, unemployment fell after the start of the New Deal and continued to fall sharply as the U.S. entered World War II. Or D, the New Deal lowered unemployment, but Allied victory in World War II lowered it further. Okay, so there's a few things here that we've got to look at. The question itself is straightforward, but the answer choices are kind of odd. Okay? So unless the correct answer really jumps out at you, start by picking out the weakest option. Okay? A is the first one I'd get rid of. Within a year, the New Deal had raised unemployment to its pre-depression level. Okay, so raising unemployment is a bad thing, right? If we know that the Great Depression starts in 1929, here's pre-depression level, here's the height, right? So 1933 is when FDR comes into office, so we can assume somewhere in this period here is where the New Deal starts, right? Somewhere between 1933 and 1955. So obviously we can see the unemployment rate is going down, okay? So A, within a year, the New Deal had raised unemployment to its pre-depression level. So if nothing about that makes sense, that would mean that if before the Great Depression started, unemployment was high. The New Deal brought it back up to that level, but that's not what's going on, right? So this graph is showing us the Great Depression starts, unemployment goes from very low to very high, and the New Deal starts to bring it back down, right? That's basically what's happening. Okay? So we know A doesn't make sense. B is the other one I would throw out. Within a year, the New Deal had lowered unemployment to its level. We know that just by looking at this chart, we might not have a lot of details, but we can tell that unemployment starts to go down because of or partly because of the New Deal, right? So we can see unemployment starts to go down. B is not correct because it says lowered it to its pre-depression level. So if this were to go all the way down below 5% again, then B would be right. But it doesn't. It doesn't go down that low. It goes down pretty low. So I'm throwing out A and B right away. Okay. Let's look at C and D because those are kind of those are the last two that are left, right? So as I'm seeing kind of people dropping in and dropping out, I'm hoping my connection is okay. I'm kind of fearful that maybe that's the problem. If that is the case and some of you aren't being able to hear me great, then check the YouTube channel. And usually those videos that are posted can be better if there is some kind of connection problem. Just putting that out there if that indeed is the case. Okay, thanks, Caleb. Just checking in. Anytime I see people kind of coming and going like that, I kind of start to think that there's a connection issue. And like I said, it's either that or it's just my boringness rubbing off on them. So let's look at these last two choices for number 3, and then keep moving on. C, unemployment fell after the start of the New Deal. So New Deal somewhere in here. So unemployment falls and continued to fall sharply as the United States entered World War II. Okay, so if we scroll back up, we know the U.S. enters World War II in 1941. Okay, World War II starts in 1939. World War II ends in 1944. Okay, so I'm just saving us from scrolling up and down. So C kind of seems like an odd choice, but it's not necessarily blatantly wrong. It kind of makes sense. Unemployment starts to go down as the New Deal takes effect, and it does go down when the U.S. enters World War II. But there's this kind of up and down in between here that seems odd. So let's see if D is a better option. D says the New Deal lowered unemployment, but Allied victory in World War II lowered it further. Okay? When I've done this question with students before, D tends to be people's favorite choice. But the tricky thing here, and the reason that D is actually not correct, because Allied victory in World War II happens in 1944. Okay? So victory isn't lowering the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is already low by the time the World War II is over and the Allies win. Okay? So D would be correct if the unemployment rate was still high in 1944 and then dropped sharply right after it, right? But the fact that it's already low means that World War II ending didn't actually lower the unemployment rate, right? What's more likely the case is that the New Deal helped lower it, and then the actual war, World War II, is what lowered it the rest of the way, right? Again, because it mobilized so many people to create new stuff and produce goods and services for the troops. So even though it's kind of an odd, it's oddly worded and it's kind of a misleading one, C is actually the right answer here. Unemployment fell after the start of the New Deal, continued to fall sharply after the U.S. entered World War I or II. So it's basically skipping over this part here, but it's not necessarily wrong, and so that's why it's correct. But it's kind of a tricky, and it's kind of meant to be tricky, which is kind of dumb, but that's just the way the GED goes sometimes. All right, so let's look at. I think I want to skip this one and just We've got 4 more minutes. Let me pull up the other questions that I've got. So let's look at these 2 questions. Should be pretty short, but let me at least do these 2 questions, and then we'll kind of we'll do these 2 questions and then call it a day. So let me zoom in a little bit. Good. So let's do question 15. So question 15 just looks at deaths from international wars, 1820 to 1980. So we see it's relatively low, with the exception of this big bar here and this big bar here. So World War I, World War II. Which question about the history of international wars can be answered by using information in the graph? So for those of you that don't know, these practice questions are actually real questions from old GED tests when it used to be a paper test. So I've got copies of official GED tests from however many years ago that was, 20 years. So this should give you a pretty realistic example of what questions are like on the test. Now they've reformatted the test since, so it's not exactly the same, but you get the idea. So let's look at our answer choices. There are 5 answer choices. 1, why did the number of deaths caused by war increase in the 20th century? And remember, we're looking to see which of these questions can be answered by the information. So why did the number of deaths caused by war increase in the 20th century? Can we answer that question just by looking at it? No, right? That question can't be answered by the graph alone. You would need some other explanation as well. Right? 1 is wrong. 2, during which decade in the 20th century did war cause the most deaths? Okay, so a decade is 10 years. Can we look there and tell which decade there was the most war? Or, sorry, deaths due to war? Probably, right? It seems like 1940s. But let's wait, let's hold off on that and make sure that we're right. 3, to what extent did the number of war deaths change in 1990? 1990 is not on that chart, so we can't figure that out. 4, how many civilians compared with soldiers died in international wars? Is there anything on there about soldiers dying versus civilians? No, it's just people, right? So number 4 is not right. And number 5, which areas of the world have been most severely affected by the war? Again, is there anything on there that references location or country or where people are from? No. It just looks at global deaths as a result of international war. So the only question we can answer is number 2. Which decade in the 20th century did war cause the most deaths? Hell. All right. And so the last question we'll do is this one right here. And we'll go through it quick because we're running out of time. Which conclusion about migration during World War II is confirmed by clear evidence in the map? So basically we have west, north, and the south, and all these arrows are people migrating within the country from these areas to like wherever the areas are, wherever the arrows are pointing, right? So 1, fewer people migrated during this time than before World War II. 2, the majority of migrants were women workers. Right? So 1 and 2 don't seem like things we could sufficiently tell by looking at the map. All right. 3, the government encouraged people to move to the north. 4, racial tensions developed in several large cities. Or 5, a large number of people moved to the west. Which of those things can we conclude is true based on the map? And again, based on the map and only the map. The first 4, there's not enough evidence to say definitively that they are true. So the only one that makes sense is number 5. A large number of people move to the west. There you go. Okay. So there's a couple or a few practice questions for you. Tomorrow we will finish up U.S. history, and then we'll spend Wednesday and Thursday kind of revisiting it and reviewing it. So if you do have questions or things you want to go over in more detail in regards to U.S. history, let me know, and I can do that on Wednesday and Thursday. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful. That's all I've got. So stick around for reading class at 12:15 if you are wanting help with reading, and I will be back at 1:15 with my daily science class. Otherwise, I'll see you back here for social studies tomorrow morning. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good one.